We've had some announcements. We want to remember Iris Davis. I did speak with Dee this week, and she said they were going to try to be here today, but with the kind of problems, obviously, that where the weather and that kind of thing. But she said that Cecil was doing okay, but was a little down. I don't think he likes having to live in her house, and which I understand. But I think that's something we want to remember. Gary Ward, who's related to the Wards here, and his parents were living in Memphis, has passed from, he had cancer and COVID. Iris has a broken ankle, and evidently COVID. The Baptist church over here is not meeting this morning. I don't know why, but makes you wonder. I know the Quail Baptist, I talked to Anthony this morning, that they were not meeting because of exposure to COVID. So we want to be careful. That Amarillo and the Panhandle area is vulnerable right now. We want to be careful. I urge everyone to be careful. Next Sunday, we are going to, at least the plan is that we will be gone for a wedding of all things. But that's all right. But Jim Dixon has agreed to come speak next week, and then I will be in school again to plan the next week. So the next 2 weeks, Jim is going to be here, and then the Sunday after that will be the November 15th, and we are going on November 15th to have our Thanksgiving meal together after church up at the Lions. So let's remember that. But all those things are good to remember. Also, Jim's daughter that is a teacher in Canadian, she and her husband have COVID. And so I'm sure Jim is worried about that. So let's keep that in mind also. Last week we talked about the presence of God there in Isaiah 64. And I think that many times preachers end up preaching to themselves more than anyone else. And that's probably good. But we think, well, if I need to hear that, maybe somebody else does too. And so I spoke on the presence of God, because sometimes I have a hard time translating between my head and my heart. The things I know in my head, sometimes I don't always feel. And so we were talking, and when we left, I asked for comments from people. Where do you feel God, or where do you see God? And I got some good responses. Some of them from the congregation here, and some of them from people that listen to the sermon online. I got some comments from them. Some of them were very individualized, and some of them were very common amongst each other. And that was good, but I appreciate that. I appreciate it makes me realize people are listening, and that's good. That provides an encouragement to me when we have that kind of response. But also I learn, is that when other people speak to me, that I learn, and that is good. And I appreciate all the comments we got. But as we were looking at it, and I was thinking about the presence of God, and some of the comments that were made, it made me think of the prophet Elijah. And I'm sure y'all realize that I like the prophet Elijah. I like his stories. And he certainly is an example of someone who was aware of the presence of God. Not just intellectually, but in his heart and in his life, that he could see it. And I thought he would make a good example to illustrate some of the things that people said to me. And we're going to talk about Elijah. It tells us in James that Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. And he prayed fervently that it might not rain, and for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. Elijah is one of the prophets that the Jewish people thought a lot of. If you were to go to a Passover supper with Jewish people today, they would have a seat reserved for Elijah, that he might show up, and he would need to have a seat. And he is still a very influential person in the Jewish religion. But he was one of the prophets, and here we have James talking about it, is that Elijah did pray, and it quit raining in Israel for 3.5 years. And then God speaks to him again. And the thing is the king and the queen at this time of Israel are Ahab and Jezebel. And Ahab and Jezebel are not happy with Elijah. And they have people looking for him all over. They can't find him because they realize that he is one of the problems, or in their view, one of the problems. And then Elijah decides to go talk to Ahab. And when Ahab is there, he says, Ahab said to him, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" And I like that phrase, "you troubler of Israel." And one of the things, and I'm probably one of the worst, is I get the idea that sometimes you just need to get along with people. And I'm not running that down. But sometimes we need to have a little bit of ability to talk with other people, even if they disagree with us. I think we can certainly see that politically right now. Is that even though someone may disagree with us, we can still talk to them. We can still have communion with one another. That we can still have community with one another, even if we disagree. But there are some times that we need to stand and be a troubler of Israel, or being a troubler of our community, and say the truth. And one of the ways that Elijah decides, or through God, that he is going to have a contest, and we know that story, is that Elijah says to Ahab, "You gather up the people of Israel, you take them to Mount Carmel, and you bring the priests of Baal." Ahab's wife Jezebel was a great fan of Baal, and she had lots of priests of Baal there. One of the problems with this country of Israel. You bring those priests of Baal, and we're going to have a contest. And we're going to let the people see this contest. And the priests of Baal, they agree. And 450 priests of Baal show up. And the idea is they're going to each of them prepare a sacrifice. And the priests of Baal are going to call on Baal to come down and light it. And then Elijah by himself will do that. And the priests of Baal go first. And y'all know the story. That they march around their altar with the sacrifice, and they call on Baal, and they cut themselves, and it says it gushed blood. They must have been cutting themselves badly. Calling on Baal. Nothing happens. And so Elijah sometimes could be quite a braggart, a taunter, and he taunts them. And nothing happens. And then when it comes to Elijah's turn, he tells the people to build an altar. He tells the people to prepare a sacrifice, and then to pour water on that sacrifice. He digs a ditch around it, and they pour enough water on the sacrifice that the water runs down and fills the ditch. And then he engages in a public prayer. And when he engages in a public prayer, God manifests himself, and it burns that altar, the sacrifice, sucks up the water, everything, when he calls on the Lord. And then, of course, they kill the priests of Baal. And so we see that God was there in a public prayer. And sometimes I think that we need to realize that God is here when we have a public prayer. That sometimes we need to stand up and be a troubler of our world by telling the truth and speaking the truth in a prayer. And I think that we can learn from Elijah's example. But it still hasn't rained yet. They're still in a drought. So Elijah says to Ahab, "Prepare for rain." And then he goes up on the mountain and he prays. His head's between his knees and he's praying. He has a servant. He says to his servant, "Go look over the sea." What do you see? Don't see anything. He sends him back again and again until the servant sees, "I see one cloud way out there that looks like a fist." And Elijah says, "You go tell Ahab that he needs to get off the mountain because a flood's coming." And Elijah begins to run. And he runs from Mount Carmel down to the city of Jezreel. And Ahab is also leaving the Mount Carmel, going down to Jezreel. And Ahab is in a chariot. And Elijah is running. And Elijah outruns him. And evidently that's approximately 15 miles. And he gets down there to the city of Jezreel. And just think, he's seen God in a public prayer. He has seen God manifest himself in nature. And I know we see God in a storm because it is raining. It's began to rain with Elijah. We also sometimes we might see him in a sunrise or just in the beauty of nature. But God does manifest himself in nature if we will just look. And I think that's one of my main problems is sometimes I just don't look. But when Elijah gets to Jezreel, the city of Jezreel, imagine his attitude there. He has asked God to send down fire, and God has done it. He has asked God for rain, and it has rained, even though it hasn't rained in 3.5 years. He has outrun a horse and a chariot for 15 miles. My attitude, I got to tell you, I'd be feeling pretty good. I'd be feeling I'm doing pretty good here. That I would be feeling like I'm pretty powerful. That the people should be ready to follow God after they've seen this. But it says that when he got to the city of Jezreel, Ahab goes to his wife and tells them everything that Elijah has done. And Jezebel says to Elijah, sends a messenger. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. He had killed the priests of Baal. Jezebel is saying, I'm going to kill you. And when you think of this, what should of Elijah's reaction have been? That when he has had God on his side, and he's seen God do these mighty things, that you would think that he would just say, wait a minute, why don't I just ask God to send a little fire down on Jezebel? That's not what happens. For whatever reason, Elijah is afraid. And even though he's just run 15 miles, he begins to run again. He runs to escape Jezebel. And he runs and he runs. It says he goes to Beersheba. From the city of Jezreel to the city of Beersheba is about 100 miles, approximately. And when he gets there, he lets his servant go. He runs on out into the desert, and he gets under a tree, and he goes to sleep. And this is one of the things that happens, is while he is under the tree, an angel shows up. And the angel touches him and gives him food and water. And he sleeps again. And when I think of that, I think of the angel showing up and touching him, touches him twice, gives him food twice and water twice. It's how important that is in our lives. That if we are looking at our community and we're looking at God showing up, and this was not God, this was an angel, but when the angel showed up, the angel touched Elijah and gave him something to eat and to drink. And I think as a community we need to learn from that sometimes how important it is that we have a touch with each other, that we share a meal with each other, and that we share communion with each other. And we see that God showed up as this angel, through this angel, with Elijah. And again, when I'm talking about touching, I'm not trying to get anybody to violate any medical advice. I am not. But we need to know that having contact with one another is important. That having that communion with one another is important. That we have time that we can share a meal and share communion and have a touch, even if that is a little bit remotely. But after the angel feeds Elijah, Elijah again begins to run. And it says that he runs all the way down to the very southern part of Judah, to the Mount Horeb, which is the same mountain that sometimes is referred to in the Bible as Mount Sinai. This is the mountain where Moses was, where Moses on the burning bush, that's where he was. And when they come back and he goes up onto the mountain to get the 10 Commandments, he's at Mount Sinai. And God manifests at Mount Sinai. And Elijah goes to a cave. And he is hiding in this cave on Mount Sinai. Makes you wonder that when Moses was in a cleft of the rock, I'm not trying to say it's the same, but it was there. It was on the same mountain. And there it tells that God, there he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And when we have this, we see that Elijah responds, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And when we look at this, Elijah is there, and when God asks him, what are you doing here, Elijah? Does Elijah actually answer that question? I find this in court all the time, that somebody will ask a question of the witness, and they answer the question, but they don't actually answer it. And I say this all the time. Listen to the question asked. Answer it the best you can. Rely upon your attorney to follow up anywhere it's necessary. But listen to the question asked and see what it is. And that's not what Elijah does. He gives God the answer that he wants to give. I've been very jealous for the Lord. And the people of Israel have thrown down your altars, killed your prophets. And I only am left. And they seek to take my life away. And you got to think, here's Elijah, that he's been high. When he's on the mountain with Mount Carmel and he has the rain come and fire comes down, he has to be very high. But now he's depressed. And I understand people are trying to kill him. He's out here by himself in the middle of the wilderness in a cave, living in a cave, and people are seeking his life to take it away. And God says to him, come out and see. And when he comes out of the cave, or before he comes out of the cave, it says that there is a fire, a wind comes across, a great wind that breaks rocks. We know those kind of winds. We've seen those kind of winds. We know what that's like. And then an earthquake comes. But God is not in the earthquake, and God is not in the fire. And then a great, there's the wind, there's an earthquake, and then there's a fire. And all these come. And none of them is God in. He's not in the wind. He's not in the earthquake. He's not in the fire. And here's Elijah in a cave, in a mountain, wanting to die, basically. Reminds me of another time in the Bible where we have that. Same sort of situation. You know, in chapter 6 of the book of Revelation, it speaks of the 7 seals. And the Lamb begins to open the 7 seals. And that's where we have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. We have war, pestilence, famine, and death. That pale horse comes when the rider appointed is death, and Hades follows after him. And then we have 2 more seals that are broken. And everything is going bad on the earth. People are suffering on the earth. And it says that people, both the kings and the poor and the rich and the slave and the free, are all going to the mountains, hiding in the caves, wanting the mountain to fall on them. Which reminds me of this, what we have here. And what it says, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. We have war and pestilence and famine and death have come. But it says that when these people are there, they're in the end of Revelation chapter 6. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? Is that we have this great day of wrath has come, and who can stand? And sometimes I think we're in that same situation. Although we may not be in the middle of an apocalyptic event, we look around at the world, we look at our life, and we ask ourselves, who can stand what's going on now? With the violence that we have in our world, that the diseases that we have in our world, who can stand? But when we look at chapter 6 of Revelation, it talks about 7 seals. And 6 of those seals are opened in chapter 6. The 7th seal is not opened until chapter 8. And in between 6 and 8, of course, is chapter 7. And in chapter 7, we have a completely different vision. We have a vision of the throne room of God. And it says that the throne room is filled with a multitude beyond counting. And their robes are white. And one of the elders, one of the 24 elders, speaks to John and asks him, who are these people? And John answers, therefore they are before the throne of God, and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. And so when we're looking for the presence of God, it is to shelter us. It is to keep us. And when we are faced with those situations like in the apocalypse, or when we're looking at Elijah, that he's in the cave wanting to die, because he's all alone and people are seeking to kill him, it is the presence of God that we turn to. That hasn't changed since Elijah's time or the time of John or today. That it's the presence of God that will protect us. And now this is one with back in Moses. Moses and God is talking to Moses in the burning bush. And Moses is arguing with God, saying, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. I'm not able to do this. And God is saying, you need to go to Egypt to rescue your people. And when Moses is talking to God and coming up with excuse after excuse why he can't do it, God tells Moses, but I will be with you. And those are the comforting words that we have. When Jesus is leaving, what does he say when he's ascending? I will be with you even until the end of the age. And so we have these examples, whether it be in a meal or in affliction, that we see God in affliction sometimes. We see God in nature. We see God in public prayer. These examples are there of the presence of God and Him being with us. That's true then and it's true today. And sometimes we really just need to look. And that's one of my problems. Is that sometimes I don't see the presence of God because I don't look. Don said this morning that sometimes we let the urgent take precedent over the important. And I do that sometimes. And it helps to be reminded that God promises us that He will be with us, even in adversity. But there in 1 Kings chapter 18, one of the things that God says to Elijah is, what are you doing here, Elijah? And when he asks him that twice, and Elijah gives him the same answer both times. And what does God do? Sometimes I think that when we wonder about what would God do when we disobey, or we're not having the right attitude, did He get mad at us or punish us? That's actually not what God does here. He doesn't punish Elijah. He does correct him. He does tell him that, no, you're not alone. There are others. But I want you to go to Damascus to anoint a new king. To a foreign country, Assyria, to the country of Syria, and anoint a new king. And one of the things about it, when you think about that, is what is between the southern part of Judah and Syria. Israel is between there, which is where Jezebel is and Ahab is, that they are looking to kill him. And God says, you need to go north, which is going right through the area where they're trying to kill him. But He says, you go. That is what He tells him. Go. And so when He says, what are you doing here? He gives him something to do. And I think sometimes we miss that point. And the thing I want to ask us is if God were to ask, what are you doing here today? And what if He were to say, what are you doing here, Stuart? How would I answer that question? And if He were to say that to any one of us, what are you doing here? And I think that's something that we need to be able to answer. That we need to be able to think about that question. What are you doing? It's amazing when God was talking to Moses, He wanted him to go do. When He's talking to Elijah, His command is to go do. And when He's talking to the disciples, there in Matthew 28, it is go and do. And so when we are looking at our lives with Christ, our lives in obedience to God, I think it is important to ask, what are you doing here? Just like He asked that to Elijah, and He asked it a couple of times. And so I'm going to leave you with that. I want you to think, and I want you to answer yourself, what are you doing here? And I think that is something that we need to answer. But the lesson is yours. If you have a need, if you have a desire to put on Christ, or if you have a need of prayers, if you would come as we stand and as we sing.